Hello everybody, it's Andy here, and we've got Embers, Rich, and our guest on here, Jason Sylvester, who's also known as Diogenes of Mayberry. It's difficult to get the tongue around that sometimes.
Diogenes of Mayberry.
Diogenes of Mayberry. Do you want to tell us why, Jason?
Well, Diogenes was the Greek cynic who told Alexander that, get out of my light. He was basically disdainful of human stupidity in general. And Mayberry, because that's the fictional setting of the old Andy Griffith show with Ron Howard, the wholesome sort of small town American values. So it came out. I started writing my first book during the election with Obama, when the first election of Obama back around 2008, 2009, when the Republican right just kept harping about, small town, wholesome, Christian values. So I'm basically the cynic of small town USA, even though I don't live in the United States, and I'm not American. So, but criticizing American evangelicals.
Because you're in Bangkok, aren't you? And it's like 10 o'clock at night, and so
Yeah.
It's good to have you on, mate. And the reason why we got you on is basically because what we wanted to talk about on this podcast was the Bible, myth, truth, the difference between the two. And we've had some long conversations about a lot of this stuff. And I've got to say, you've educated me a lot on some of the myths of the Bible. And I wanted to sort of go through some of those because, again, sure, one of the things that theists tend to do is they either go full on, young earth creationists, everything in the Bible is completely true, to the letter, everything. It's a history of our world, right through to the other side of that, which is people using the Bible as analogy or it's stories, moral stories to try and sort of get some sort of point across, and when I've talked to you, it's always been something completely different. So it'd be great to talk about some of the things that you've sort of looked at. I mean, we talked a little bit about the patriarchs. Do you want to sort of just have a little bit of a chat about this concept right from the beginning, the patriarchs, right from the beginning of the Bible?
So a lot of the material needs to be contextualized. And I think that's what a lot of the theists who read the Bible literally, and even maybe not ones who don't necessarily take every word literally, but they still tend to think that the Bible is some sort of historical document. And a lot of it really needs to be understood in the political context. And the more I research, even in my new book, the amount of politics that is in religion is just astounding. So if you look back to the sort of critical time is around 622 BCE, and this is what is known as the Josianic reform. So King Josiah, around 622, is in a unique position. So prior to Josiah, the kingdom of Judah is a vassal state of the Assyrian Empire. But around his time, the Assyrian Empire is waning. So they're under pressure in the east from the Medes and the Persians, and in the west from the Egyptians. So basically, the Assyrian Empire has collapsed. They're no longer a vassal state of that empire. But Egypt is starting to rise again. Now, you go back about 400 years, 400 or 500 years, and more. The land of Canaan was actually a province of Egypt, which is one of the reasons why the Exodus story doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because they would have just gone from one Egyptian province to another. So they're reasserting their authority, and one of the things they wanted, Egypt wants to control Canaan, because that's a strategic link on the trade route between Egypt and the Assyrian Empire in what is known as Mesopotamia, right, the land between the rivers. So you have to come up the coast of Canaan, modern Israel, to get up into like Damascus, and then onto the trade route through the Fertile Crescent. So it's a strategic trade route. So at the time Egypt is rising, Josiah wants to reassert authority himself for Israel. And so they craft this big, long narrative. So the patriarchs is one of them. So just to jump back a little bit. So the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were actually two separate kingdoms. This whole united monarchy thing of David and Solomon is a myth that comes out of the Josianic reforms. They were separate kingdoms. They obviously have cultural roots, coming out of the same sort of people and settling down, but two distinct kingdoms. So about 100 years before the Assyrians, before the Babylonians, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, before the Assyrian Empire falls, the Assyrians had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And that actually it's one of the historical facts in the Bible that's actually true. The fact that the Assyrians had basically decimated the northern kingdom of Israel and deported the population. And that's actually, you see that right up through the Persians. That's actually a tool of imperial control. You break people's lands, ties to the lands, and you move them somewhere else. Then you take someone from somewhere else and you move them in to the northern lands of Israel, which also kind of ties in later to the post-exile, Babylonian exile, prescriptions not to date foreigners, because obviously the Assyrians had moved in some foreigners into northern Israel. So it's really complex and complicated. Mm-hmm. So Israel is basically empty. There are, some people, some remnants who are there. A lot of those have come south into Judaism. And so the northern kingdom of Israel is basically bare, but it's also the much better land. Like that's where the olive groves are, the olive presses. Judah is very barren and arid. Israel is much more an agricultural climate and lands. So as part of the patriarchal narrative, the priests and the Josianic reform, they create the patriarchal narrative. And one of the scholars actually says, if you look at the hierarchy, so Abraham, the stories of Abraham are centered around Hebron and Jerusalem. So we make him the grandfather, and then the son, Isaac, his stories are centered, I can't remember exactly where those ones are, but the stories of Jacob, the grandson, are centered up in the north, up in the kingdom of Israel. And so this one scholar was actually hypothesizing that there might have been some ancestral truth that these were, somewhat legendary tribal leaders in those respective areas. And so this hierarchy of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is then a tool of, not subjugation is probably the wrong word, but a hierarchy that, okay, so Abraham is the patriarch, the first patriarch, and Jacob up in the northern lands of Israel was the grandson. So you get sort of this ranking that way. And so they kind of create this epic of this great family narrative. Like, see, the lands of Israel, they used to belong to us under David and Solomon, and then these wicked kings of Israel, went off on their own. And if you actually read the book of Kings, it's like, they all the kings of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. It's just blatant propaganda. To the winner writes the history, right? So they create this big family narrative. The same thing happens in the Exodus. So Egypt is trying to take over, so they create the Exodus story. That, hey, we beat Egypt before, we can do it again. And so it's all about creating this big family narrative, and they're projecting themselves back into the Bronze Age. Now, the archaeology has proven that Israel does not exist as a separate people, a distinct people in the Bronze Age. The Jewish people are a product of the Bronze Age collapse and the dawn of the Iron Age. So when the city-states collapsed, these formerly we would today call them Bedouins, these nomadic herders of sheep and goats who would normally have traded with the city-states that all collapsed at the Bronze Age collapse, then move into the Central Highlands and settle down. And that's when you see the beginnings of the Israelite culture emerging, around, say, 1100 BCE. And then you get the stories of David and Solomon around 1900 BCE. And so a lot of it is very contextualized. So you've got to understand that in 622, Josiah and his priests are creating this whole narrative of, we are one big happy family once, therefore I am entitled to take the lands of the kingdom of Israel from myself, because they used to belong to my ancestors anyways. Then they went off and did their own thing, but I'm essentially allowed to have it. And it's called the documentary hypothesis, and there's some debate over how accurate it is, but I think it has some merit. That if you look at things like, why are there two names for God, Jehovah and Elohim? Why are there two sanctuaries, Jerusalem and Bethel? And they postulate that this is the merging of the northern and southern traditions during the time of Josiah. So they can't just eradicate the northern traditions. They've got to find a way to incorporate them. So the northern god is El, the northern sanctuary is Bethel, And so it all starts coming together, and that's why you have two priesthoods, the Aaron and the Levites. So a lot of, again, is very, very contextual. So,
because it sort of seems like it's turning it from this wondrous mythical story of the patriarchs into a document, or like a political document. It's like it's changing the narrative completely. If you read what it actually is, and if you understand what's actually happened from a historical point of view, you suddenly realize that the Bible isn't some magical journey of humanity. It's actually politics on a page.
And I think what I just want to pick up actually on a little side comment that you actually made throughout that. And when you were describing that initial circumstances, you turned around and said, and that's one story, one of the few stories in the Bible that's actually true. Right. And the very fact that there are actually so few stories in the Bible that are actually true, that you could make a statement like that. I mean, even, we do have the hardcore evangelicals in this country. We do have them. They're not as loud and they're not as powerful as they are, say, in the US, but they are out there. And in fact, we nearly had one running Northern Ireland for a little while, but that's a discussion for another day. But even some of the more, say, liberal-minded believers, certainly those that I know, the vast majority of believers that I know are fairly liberal-minded believers. They still think that there is elements of truth in some of these old stories. And how do we actually go about deconstructing that for them, helping them understand that actually, no, the vast majority of this stuff is either simply made up out of whole cloth, or, as you say, actually made up, taking grains of truth and making up stories around them to perpetuate a political agenda. How do we actually do that?
I would think you need to encourage them to read the scholarship that's out there. The funny thing is the archaeological scholarship. It's only been the last generation or two, within the last 20 to 40 years, that the archaeological methodologies have radically shifted. Because prior to about, say, 1980-ish, the archaeologists were going out there with a biblical agenda. It was called the spade in one hand and the Bible in the other. And they were going out there and were looking for things to confirm the Bible. And so they would force fit.
Yeah. Wasn't there an Israeli, a pair of Israeli archaeologists that was sent there into the Sinai Peninsula back in the 60s, and was told by the president of Israel at the time, go and dig up the title deeds to Israel. And they came back and they said, we've pretty much dug up the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula, and there is no evidence whatsoever that the Exodus, the key foundational story, really, is true. It was Finkelstein, and what was the name of the other chap?
Silverman. Well, I don't know. Silverman. Well, the documentary. It's actually a book, and then it became a documentary. It's called The Bible on Earth, which is written by Finkelstein and Silverman. Whether they were the archaeologists who went out in the 60s, I don't know if that was them or not.
I don't know. But there was that, and that happened, and they came back and they said, I'm sorry, but it just isn't there.
Yeah. Back in 2016, the Israel Museum put on an exhibition, and the hall for the Exodus was an empty room. So here's even the Israel Museum in Israel putting on this exhibition and saying there's nothing there. It's a story.
So, but there are bound to be a few little grains of touching on truth, because things like major battles, we already have archaeological and historical evidence to back that up. Nothing to do with the Bible or Scripture. We would have known about that even if it wasn't mentioned in Scripture. So that's already existed. So it's surprising that people who put the disparate various texts of the Scripture together over many years actually knew about these battles I mean, they'll be closer to them then than we are, but we have the evidence irrespective of what's in Scripture.
For something, yeah, not for everything.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about everything. I'm talking about
Yeah.
sort of major battles of Assyrians. So we know about that anyway.
Right.
Do you know what surprises me though is that the archaeologists would go into the Holy Land, as you say, Jason. We'd look at Bible in one hand and spade in the other, and putting any credence on the Bible as some sort of roadmap to history, without because that doesn't seem like the sort of thing that even in you say it's pre-80s, but it doesn't seem like the sort of thing that even pre-80s that someone people of science would have tried to shoehorn the history into the Bible. Rather, they would just go there, look at the evidence, and then
religion is a powerful set of blinders.
Yeah, I mean, so I remember you talking about something about the the Walls of Jericho, the story of the Walls of Jericho.
Right. That was Kathleen Kenyon, I think, in the 50s. Yeah, I think it was in the 1950s. Kathleen Kenyon went out and did a dig on Jericho. And if you look at the timeline in the Bible of when the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan supposedly took place, say sort of around 1200 BCE in that area, that sort of like the late Bronze Age. And what Kenyon found was that the walls of Jericho had been destroyed in the middle of the Bronze Age. So say around like 1500, and the city had basically been abandoned ever since. So Jericho had long been abandoned. And one of you gentlemen just mentioned a minute ago about like sort of historical grains of truth. And I think that's what is happening in a lot of these biblical stories is there is some sort of historical nugget that's been passed down through the oral tales, and then they get sort of wrapped up in these new biblical tales and given a new life, a new lease on life with a new sort of background story. So it might have been very well known that Jericho had been destroyed several hundred years ago.
Because when you think about it, if you think about the way this actually works, in this concept of human history and the timelines and all that sort of thing, it's not surprising, really, is it, that a story like the Walls of Jericho or Jericho gets involved or embroiled with a damn good story that they're putting together, and it's like, oh, we can put that in and we can put that in, and that make it more festive. Because a lot of these stories, I guess, before they were actually written down, were oral stories. These were sort of sitting around the fire, telling about their history, and so you can understand how that happens. What puzzles me is how it gets put into a book. And as you say, there's a lot of politics within that, and it's written through a political view or through a political lens. But it just seems strange that today we look back on the stories within the Bible and sort of justify them as a religious narrative that people still follow today. And this is, I mean, we've talked about this on here, and also through ourselves and stuff, like when we just chat online and stuff, that we don't understand why people follow the Bible, because we're atheists and that's what we do. We don't understand why people follow the Bible because some of the stories in there are pretty atrocious, and there's not much morality going on in there.
And so obviously false.
Yeah, and so obviously
so obviously nonsense.
Yeah, it just baffles me, and this is why I wanted to get Jason on, because there's all these big stories in the Bible. The things like the flood, and the story of Job, which I've often sort of brought up about, because to me that was one of the things when I was a kid, when I read the Bible, I read that story of Job, and I just went, this is monstrous. Well, if God's real and this is a real entity, and he did this to someone on earth for a bet, if you don't know the story of Job, go and read it. It'll make you wonder what the hell.
Yeah, well, the story of Job was written. So with the Josianic reforms comes sort of not probably the birth of monotheism, but the institutionalization of state monotheism with Josiah. Now, the story of Job was probably written about 200 years before that. So, and with monotheism, when you only have one God who's responsible for everything, suddenly, how do you blame God for evil? And so that's when Satan starts to emerge, because Satan is basically an existential reaction to monotheism. So when the story of Job is written about 200 years before the institutionalization of monotheism, you wouldn't necessarily have had this this problem of evil, which is known as theodicy. And so there's some contextualism there as well. So one of the interesting points in the documentary For the Bible on Earth is a professor named Baruch Halpern, and he made a brilliant comment. And it's one of my favorite comments is that the temple in Jerusalem just happens to sit in the backyard of the royal palace. So that tells you how interlinked the politics are with the religion, and that's why the Davidic dynasty has so much hold over the Jewish mentality and Christians to some extent. So,
Jason, I was going to ask you something. You mentioned it a while ago, but characters like Abraham, etc. Were you on any evidence whatsoever that they existed?
As I said, as they existed in the patriarchal story, none, because the story of Abraham set like in 1800 BCE. The Jews do not emerge for another, say, 800 years, 900 years in the archaeological record. So from that perspective, he couldn't have existed. So as I said, this one scholar speculates that perhaps there were some of these little nuggets of historical truth, that there might have been a tribal leader in and around Hebron who was named Abraham. So that there could be some essence there, but there's unlikely we will ever find any proof, any archaeological sort of tablets with his name. It's, they could be out there, but who knows? So.
One question then, because all of our conversations so far at the moment have been largely confined to the Old Testament. Do any of these ideas transfer over into New Testament stories?
Yeah, well, like a lot of the New Testament's made up as well. So like all the Gospels are written, they're all hearsay. How would anybody have known what Jesus was saying, to anybody if they weren't there? Particularly like at the trial, the Sanhedrin trial, how would anybody have known what we said? So
yeah,
and it's all fiction. It's all fan fiction.
Yeah. I mean, I like the fact that you brought up the sort of the trials, because again, the trial before Pilate. We know that Pontius Pilate was a real person. We have archaeological and historical evidence for him, but what we have in history, what we have in the record, is a completely different character to the one that is portrayed in the Gospels, for example. So I think this is another case of having a little nugget of truth, having this person who was a real person, and then building stories upon it.
Oh yeah, all of the titles given to him have been built on top of him. So the fact that he got deified in the first place is a bastardization of the Jewish phrase "son of God." All Jews were sons of God. But where does Christianity take hold? It takes hold in the Greek world. And if you look at Greek mythology, you've got all of these stories of Zeus and other gods impregnating mortal women. It happens time and time again in Greek mythology, and you have these demigods. So the fact that Jesus becomes deified in the first place is because the Greeks misunderstand Son of God. When Jesus is talking about the Son of Man, he's talking about Daniel he's talking about Michael, the Archangel Michael, which is in Daniel chapter 12, which says, again, this is an apocalyptic book written at the time of the Maccabean revolt, when the Jews are having an existential crisis and they're seeing their culture potentially being annihilated. And this apocalyptic book comes out and says, Michael will stand up and defend us, and he's the Son of Man. So that gets Jesus is talking about, hey, Michael's coming any day. You can set your watch. Michael will be here. Don't worry. He's coming in our lifetimes. It's happening.
Well, that's a new thing I've learned today. Thank you.
Yeah.
So obviously you've written these books and you're writing another one at the moment. And before we came on, we were talking about how do we, because I've listened to some of your conversations before, and I've listened to some of the things that you've said, and sometimes it runs away from me. And what I'm thinking, and one of the things that we're interested in doing is trying to get people to understand that these books are mythologies, that these stories are all made up, and we have, as you demonstrate, the evidence to prove that these things are all made up. How do we make that accessible to the ordinary, everyday person on the street? Someone who isn't perhaps likely to go out and read scholarship, for example.
You could maybe have some of these. One of the things I've noticed is, people don't really like to read. YouTube seems to be the more chosen vehicle these days for people. They can just sit back and watch a video. So maybe have more of these discussions where you can kind of discuss, one, that the Bible is political, two, that a lot of the stories are made up, three, that there's a lot of forgeries in the Bible. Even there's whole books that are forged. Like Bart Ehrman has written a book called Forged, that there's entire books of the New Testament that are forged in the name of Paul, because Paul has all this authority. And so, hey, I want to get my book accepted, so I write in the name of Paul and it gets accepted. But even within books that Paul did write, there are forged passages that have been written and inserted. And the scholars know this because they're written in different styles. And if you look at sort of where they're shoved in, like you sort of take this verse and this verse and they go together, but then, right in the middle is like this thing that just doesn't make sense. Like Paul is actually quite open and liberal about the inclusiveness of women. And I think it's in 1 Corinthians, don't quote me on that. I think it's, if I'm going from memory, it's like 1 Corinthians 14. There's a passage where Paul says women should be silent in church, but it interrupts the flow of the passages before and after it. And it also contradicts what Paul says in Romans. He's introducing women like Junia, like foremost among the apostles. And then that gets tied in with, I want to say Timothy. The Timothy was written in Paul's name, but it's describing a situation that does not exist in Paul's day, namely that there is an established church with a hierarchy, which does not exist in Paul's day. These are individual communities. All of Paul's letters are written to all these communities, the community in Corinth, the community in Galatia, et cetera, et cetera. But when Timothy is written, you're now well into the 2nd century. The prophecy of Jesus that thou shalt not taste death till my Father's kingdom have come. The last apostle has died. Nothing's happened. Oh shit. How are we going to rebrand our story? So now the church has settled in and you now have an established church. So Timothy is written at a time when there is an established church. And then Paul is saying, women, shut the hell up, go make me dinner. So that's obviously at odds with what Paul actually said about women in Romans and like that forged passage that's in Corinthians. So there's lots and lots of scholarship out there. So I think to be accessible to people, maybe we have some dialogues with them, and maybe Atheist UK can bring on some scholars. If you're, I know Andy wants to have more casual chats, but for maybe at Atheism UK after COVID, you guys could maybe invite some scholars from one of the universities to come and give a talk in public, and you could invite the local liberal Christians to come in here. So. I know
that would be fun.
So the one I would recommend, the book that sort of inspired me to write the book I'm doing right now on the history of atheism, was written by the Oxford professor, and I love his title, Professor of the History of the Church. His name's Diarmaid MacCulloch. And he wrote a book called Christianity, the First 3,000 Years. It came out in 2009. And BBC actually did a 6-part documentary series on it as well. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. So I would say if you can invite him down from Oxford, that might be good. I invited him to come on the show with me and Andy, but he declined. But maybe to come and do a live talk, maybe he would be open to something like that. But he's definitely a scholar who's got all of these facts on the New Testament at his fingertips. So.
Do you know the thing that's always struck me, and I've read this ever since I was young. There's been quite a lot of books about whether the validity of the Bible and things like that, and especially on things like the New Testament. And there's loads of stuff on YouTube about the story of Jesus, and how you've got people like Cyrus is a precursor to the story, or there's loads of Mithra, and do you know all those stories that have the same narrative of son of God, born of a woman that didn't have sex with a man, born of a virgin, and all those sort of things.
They're common mythology.
That's a mistake, isn't it? In translation, that doesn't say that she's a virgin. She says she's
the
young,
virgin
woman or something.
That's one of the points I made in my first book, Manifest Insanity, on the Judeo-Christian doctrines, is the very fact that Matthew used the word virgin tells us he's not living in Judea using the Hebrew Bible. He's living in a diaspora community using one of the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, which had made this translation error at Isaiah 7:14, which was a passage. So I mentioned earlier that Judah was a vassal state of the Assyrians. So Josiah's grandfather, Hezekiah, so that passage in Isaiah was written about Hezekiah, Josiah's grandfather, at the time when Judah was submitting to being a vassal state to Assyria. And it's saying, there will be a Davidic king who will come, who will free us from this bondage to a foreign power. And so, the fact that Matthew and then copied by Luke are using this virgin passage, it just adds fuel to the fire, the whole virgin birth narrative. And then later the Catholic Church, doubles down and they insist the perpetual virginity of Mary, that there couldn't have been other children. And it's all nonsense. One of the ones, I can't remember which scholar, there's probably several. One of them hypothesizes that Mary emerges in the mythology because Christianity is such a male-focused, there's one God and he's male, that Mary is kind of a counterbalance to that sort of one-sided. Because if you look at most mythologies throughout history, especially the Eastern mythologies, there tends to be balance. There tends to be nature and harmony, man and woman. And so that Mary is kind of a counterbalance to this. And so the cult of Mary really starts taking off in later generations.
It's also like, again, from right from childhood, I was reading a lot of books, which I've realised over time probably aren't as well researched as they should have been. But nevertheless, they were sort of books that made me think. But I always remember that concept that the story of Jesus was just pulled from lots of other types of myths, pre Jesus times, like and Osiris and Mithra and all those sort of things that born on the 25th of December, born of a virgin, and all those sort of things.
Right.
The stories really line up quite well. So even from a child, I was thinking to myself, this can't be what actually happened. It's got to just be, a mythical story built up to promote something. And do you think that's what all this is? It's just to create Christianity. Was there a purposeful reason for creating this Christ myth?
Yeah, well, I think, like I said, some of it comes from the misunderstandings, such as the Son of God, and which ultimately leads to his deification. But I think a lot of it, like the Roman Empire, was very syncretic. They tended to absorb a lot of other religions. Like they would conquer new territory, and they would either look for parallel gods, in the Roman pantheon to their pantheon, and say, oh, this is Jupiter in ours, this is his and yours. And if they didn't, they would absorb it. So there were a lot of syncretic movements to try to find common ground and merge. So yeah, there's definitely, I think, the borrowing of the Mithra and the Osiris legends probably came about as a result of the mistake made by Matthew in using that virgin, and so that was probably a later thing. I'm just speculating, but that's how I would think it would have come about.
The Christians then came up with the concept of diabolical mimicry to explain away all that. The devil planted those pre-Christ, pre-Christian stories to make it look like Jesus was actually a compendium of these previous. Again, no evidence for that whatsoever, but it's a good story.
But if But if you look at the satanic mimicry, so picture in your minds the sort of common features that Satan would have. So just sort of picture in your mind what you think Satan would have. Now start deconstructing that. So what happens as Christianity starts spreading throughout the Mediterranean is you start taking all of the gods of those cultures and you take their features and you say, oh, this is an evil god. So the horns of Satan, that's Baal. The cloven feet, that's Pan. The red body and the forked tail, that's Set in the Egyptian mythology. So they start taking all of these characteristics of the local gods and you start stapling them onto Satan.
Poor Satan.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah. So it's something that they've been very good at for forever, really, by the sounds of it, in terms of stitching these stories together and presenting them as if they are the sort of the final product. Which
I did a meme for my page a few years ago. I was speculating. I like to try to do these thought experiments where I think, 1,000, 2,000 years in the future, and what are they going to be like looking back at us? And given that people tend to be historically ignorant, they don't bother to look things up, and they just accept things on the surface. So I created a meme called Jedi Mormontology, because the Jedis, the Mormons, and Scientology all kind of have this space theme to them. And so in 1,000 years, all three of them will just emerge together into one big narrative, and no one will question it.
There's a story for a book.
Or Jason, if you get that religion going now, you could make an awful lot of money as their prophet.
Well, isn't that what L. Ron Hubbard is? You want to get rich, start a religion, and so he did. So I actually wrote. When did I write it? 2017. Yeah, I wrote a full-length screenplay on the historical Jesus, and actually this scholar, what I mentioned at Oxford, I mentioned it to him, and I talked to a Yale scholar who's helped me a lot with the Old Testament scholarship, and I said I'm working on this historical Jesus. He says we in the scholarly community have been waiting a long, long time for someone to tackle this, and apparently, who is it? There's a director who's working on it right now. I think it was the guy. It doesn't matter. I can't remember his name. He's working on this, and in my screenplay, I'm trying to make it relevant by using contemporary references. So James, the brother of Jesus, who goes on to become the head of the Jerusalem church. So when you read Paul's letters, he's talking about James and Simon Peter and John. So in my book, James I've consciously given him the traits of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon religion. Okay. And Simon Peter, I've very consciously given him the traits of L. Ron Hubbard. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Listen, just to round this off, the other day, Jason, I was talking to you about a video that I saw on YouTube, which was a rabbi talking about the first 5 books of the Torah. And I was having a chat with you about how he was justifying the stories, so the story of the flood and Genesis and Leviticus and all those sort of things. And the reason why I brought it up to you the other day was because when I was watching it, I was thinking to myself, what this guy is actually doing is making up a shell around the story that, when it's obviously very, very well practiced. I mean, it sounds like, him and his fellow rabbis have sat round tables, whether that's, virtual tables or whatever, so just talking about this and working out how the story, what it actually means, the interpretation, which is the sort of, Gnostic sort of concept of this, this hidden knowledge type thing. You don't really know the actual meaning of this, and what it struck me was that it just sounded completely made up. They're taking these books and this is what Genesis actually means. It doesn't mean it. It says in the beginning, not the beginning. This is in the beginning. It's not the very beginning, but it's in the beginning. And how the heavens and the earth were created, and how the earth was the lowest form of the lowest form of the world or the cosmos or whatever. But it just seemed to me that it just seems like a bunch of people getting around the table and going, how can we justify this? How can we justify what the actual words are? So if it wasn't actually literal that God created the world in 7 days, or everything in 7 days, the heavens and the earth, what does it actually mean? How can we translate that to the young? How can we sort of make this story palatable and like we know more than there is in the Bible? Like we're the ones that have got the knowledge.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember, I think Hitch said this, that, you got to remember, these are people who didn't know where the sun goes at night. This is like a pre-literate society who's had these oral stories that get passed around and then finally get written down during the Assyrian age. And it's the argument that these rabbis are needing to engage in this sort of mental gymnastics is because they're all arguing from authority, which we know is a logical fallacy.
Yeah.
They cannot admit that it's bullshit without unraveling their livelihood, everything they devoted their entire life to.
And their power.
And if you look at the Talmud, what is the Talmud? It's a series of discussions between rabbis, right? Where the rabbis are having these disputations and discussions of what all these things mean. So this is actually a fairly common thing throughout Judaism. Now, Maimonides, who was an Aristotelian philosopher in the late 1100s, he was sort of the first to formulate this concept of allegorism, that if something doesn't fit, like the story of Joshua stopping the sun at Jericho, obviously we know that's not physically possible, so it must be interpreted figuratively. So, and this is where Spinoza comes along, and he's like just utterly dismissive of the rabbis and Maimonides, and he says the rabbis are completely crazy, and he dismisses Maimonides completely. So, they can't just go to the lowest common denominator and say it's just nonsense, so they won't. So they have to come up with all these rationales, which is just ludicrous. So rather than just stripping it down, the ultimate regression back to, the first premises. And I was actually thinking the first convert that I know of was talking to this girl, and she'd been searching for the truth. She had been raised in a Catholic family, and she'd gone to an evangelical church, a Muslim church, and she kept searching through all these different faiths looking for the answer. And I was the first person that actually made sense to her. I said, well, how about the fact that they're all wrong? They're all starting from the premise that there is something, when the right answer is there is nothing. And that was the first time that anybody had ever given her an answer that actually made any sense. And the light just went on for her in that moment. So
incredible. Listen,
and that's what these rabbis.
We've come to the end of our time. Otherwise, we're going to overstay our welcome, and people are going to bugger off. So we're going to sort of bring this to an end. Guys, it's been great again. I love talking about this stuff. It's so interesting. If you've got any questions, put them underneath the video. Ask us anything. We can't say we were going to be able to answer everything, but we'll try in our best way we possibly can with as much honesty as we possibly can, because we've got no extra grind here. Embers, Rich, and Jason, thanks very much for joining us today.
Brilliant, and
fantastic.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and press the bell.
Yeah, subscribe. We've only just started this, and we need 100 people subscribing. Otherwise, we can't do anything. We can't push it anywhere. So yeah, please subscribe. But yeah, comment as well, because that's what we will survive on. Is like getting some feedback and that sort of thing. But anyway, all right. So that's it for today. Thanks everybody. We'll see you next time. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, thanks for joining us today, and don't forget to click that like button. Also, make a comment, and of course, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.